with Dohnányi. And there we have an opportunity to see also how much the soloist was influenced and in his interpretation, especially in regard to tempo variations, by the accompanist who changed. And I am certain they talked about Dohnányi's experiences with Joachim and when they prepared the recording. And I'm sure Spalding was quite keen on learning from Dohnányi and being inspired by this way of performance. And that's what we can hear in that case where we can do the comparison in the A major sonata.
Yes, and just to add to that, Albert Spalding was not at all coming from a Joachim school background, but at the same time, there are some rather interesting facts about his recordings. For instance, he made a recording of the Spohr Gesangsszene, I think, and he's the only violinist who more or less regards Joachim's metronome numbers for that. So I think there was a strong feeling that Joachim was his ideal, even though he probably never heard him, but his ideal as a performer of classical music and of German classical music for that. I think Spalding was certainly very much feeling in that tradition, even though he's already in many technical things in vibrato and some use of portamento and things like that. He's already of a very much more modern generation of performers.
Yeah, thank you for both of you. Kai and Johannes, I was also wondering, because I think I don't know it myself, is how did and when did you get interested in the early recordings? Because if I recall correctly, you were also doing a lot of early music, HIP, before. So yeah, this would be my first question. How did you get, what was your personal interest from early music to early recordings? And the second one, because we were discussing with Aldo about rehearsing and about how do we rehearse chamber music. Because you, yeah, as I said, I think you played a lot of early and classical repertoire with HIP groups. How different are the rehearsals in comparison to what you're doing now with romantic music, with 19th century music, and also for Kai as a coach? I mean, do you think that the early music ensembles rehearse in a different way than what you do, or what you encourage? And how do you, in general, how do you rehearse this music with an early recording mindset, so to say?
Yes, two questions. The first thing, just real quick, how did I come across early recordings? That was quite early when I was a student already. I happened to study in Freiburg and Breisgau, both modern viola and musicology at the university and at the Musikhochschule. And this is where Welte Mignon company was located. So at the Institute of Musicology, we had a large collection of music rolls and a reproducing piano. And there was a slightly older colleague of mine, Hermann Goczewski, who just did his PhD, his groundbreaking PhD on the Welte Mignon aesthetics and recording technologies. So this is how I really got acquainted with these early recordings and context of that quite quickly. And at the same time, I was studying at the Schola Cantorum Basiliensis, so I was always trying to translate what I learned in musicological contexts to performance. And as a viola player, of course, there's not much repertoire before the late 18th century, so I became very much interested in 19th century performance practices quite early on. And this is also how I met Johannes Gebaeur at the Schola Cantorum when we were students. And of course, in some groups where we worked together on well, the world first recordings of romantic repertoire like Wagner's Flying Dutchman with the Capella Coloniensis in 2004, which I had the opportunity to prepare. And we later did some more work on that. But yes, the big challenge really is not only to revive performing styles and details, all that we've been talking about. The challenge is to understand how they were rehearsing. Because if the goal really is to provide a playground of different possibilities that can be chosen from spontaneously during the performance, then of course, this is very different from the way I've been working with early music groups where everything is rehearsed a lot and where we even had a metronome in ensemble rehearsals, which was placed in the middle of the group at the rehearsal. So all these kind of strict and notational performances were completely different from what we are trying to revive now. And from reports, of course, we know that people were not only encouraged to not practice too much in the day. We have some advice by Clara Schumann, famous letters of how much they should read books and learn languages and go for a walk in fresh air and not spend so much time at the piano. At the same time, understanding musical choices, musical opportunities is much more important than mechanical training. And what you hear in these recordings is also that in some ways they are not perfect, especially if you compare them to studio recordings that are quite, of course, quite artificial in themselves as well. They are live recordings. People were much more open to things that happen in a live setting. So it is probably a result of both rehearsing in a different way from what we're now trained to do, because they did not try to present a perfect performance. They probably tried to present something that's artistically appealing and communicating, trying to get into the intentions of the composer, as they would say, in order to translate that to audiences. So audiences were also not waiting for perfection. They were rather waiting to be touched and entertained in a way that we really hear in different musical genres today, like in jazz or in other repertoire that's not considered serious. Together with all these playing characteristics, improvisation, portamentos, you hear that in other musical genres today, and this is a big challenge. Audiences say, oh, I didn't know that classical music was entertaining and emotional like this, because what they recognize many of these characteristics in other genres. So it's in a way a review also of what's been happening over the past 80 years in performing traditions in the classical world. So it's challenging in very different ways, and it does include the way we rehearse and even the way we practice, what we practice, where we put our emphasis on, and the way we expect listeners to perceive what we offer. So this is a huge topic, and we're just at the beginning of it.
Well, this is very interesting because recently I was talking to Clive, and we were planning we had to play some Beethoven trio, and he said, well, actually, we need to rehearse as little as possible in order to be historically accurate. So I think you confirm what he said. Actually, it's very interesting because I have a little quote, what Klinger in the 1930s was telling Reinecke about the so-called faultless ensemble playing. He says, faultless ensemble playing, which gets so much praise from the music critics nowadays. And Klinger says, as a matter of fact, I personally don't want that sort of ensemble, but if I put this in print, I should only be misunderstood. So already right in the 30s.
Correct.
Maybe I could just add also that for me, historical recordings have always been something, or for a long time have been something of a mystery, and something that I was fascinated in, because there was such a large variety of performance. If you compare, especially recordings made before the First World War, and I found it very difficult for a long time to actually understand that. And doing this research in Bern with Kai has Well, recordings came into the picture very automatically, because when I was researching Joachim, you obviously have these 5 recordings, which is something that makes research in Joachim's performance style in a way much easier than researching, for instance, Liszt's or Bülow's performance style, where we don't have these recordings and where we don't really know what it sounded like, or Wieniawski, to name a violinist, who we know next to nothing about how he, what his sound was, how he did his vibrato or his portamenti or anything like that, because he didn't even leave a treatise. Whereas in Joachim's case, not only have we got this 3-volume treatise of violin teaching and playing, but we also have these 5 recordings, but they are in a way also often misunderstood. I remember, for instance, a comment where one of the Joachim researchers said, well, Joachim's recordings tell us nothing about his use of vibrato. Well, that's not right. They tell us a lot about his use of vibrato, but we have to understand what he is doing on these recordings in terms of vibrato. And then we can understand perhaps more about his philosophy of vibrato. And now I'm just at the moment working on a source which is previously completely unknown, where a student was sent from Russia to Berlin to be in the lessons, get lessons from Joachim, but also be in the group lessons that he gave, and he gives us descriptions of Joachim's vibrato, for instance, and his rubato, and all these things, and suddenly it all falls into place, and we understand how these recordings represent an obviously already aging violinist who's not in the prime of his abilities. He must have played probably more brilliant when he was in his 30s and 40s, but these recordings still give us the opportunity to understand more about his playing, much more than we know about, for instance, how Mozart played, because we quite honestly haven't got a clue. All we know is descriptions, but we don't know what it sounded like.
Thank you, Johannes. We have an interesting comment of Kai in the chat, who wrote, the relation between Joachim and his grandniece Jeli Darany is a very interesting topic. Just so much, Jeli was described by the members of the Brahms Joachim circle as a rather natural violinist, especially in comparison with Joachim's other grandniece, Adila Fakiri. Both of them had an active career in the first decades of the 20th century, which means that they did adapt their playing style to more modern aesthetics and did not attempt to play like Joachim. However, their playing can still be connected to the 19th century traditions in terms of flexibility and expressivity. And then we also got a question from Nathan Pell to Johannes, who asked, have you also emulated Jeli Darany's recording of the Romance? If so, do you have thoughts about their 2 performing styles? Which aspects of Joachim's playing style survived in the 2 decades between their recordings?
Okay, that's a very good question, and I have not emulated Jeli Darany's performance of the Romance, but I have analyzed it in quite a lot of detail in my dissertation, because I analyzed Joachim's recording and 3 others, and obviously the one with Jeli Darany is a very fascinating and interesting one. Again, Kai already said something about this, but to perhaps add a few words about it, I think, well, firstly, Jeli Darany did not learn, she had 1 lesson with Joachim. She was actually too young to be really considered a student, but she was certainly feeling herself very much in that tradition still. I think she must have known Joachim's recording, and there is a lot of similarities and a lot of differences between Joachim's and Darany's recording to modern recordings recorded in the last maybe 20 years, where it's quite fascinating to listen to some of these recent recordings where you know they have listened to the Joachim recording, and still what they do in the recording is very different, because we live in different times, and the aesthetics that we are used to are completely different to what we hear in Joachim's or Dharani's recording. One of the things that is very interesting about this is that they both have a completely different concept of a romancer from modern recordings, and they both play this piece much faster than any modern recording. I find that still almost unbelievable, where you have the composer performing his own piece and sort of giving you an example of how he wants it performed. And then modern performers come along and say, well, this is not what we think it is. They obviously, well, I don't want to criticize it, but they obviously feel that the way that Joachim plays this piece is not quite right, which is quite extraordinary if you think about it.
Well, absolutely. So I was going to propose that maybe we hear a bit to the Opus 96 played by Tovi and Nadila Fakiri, so that we get an idea of how she played, and he played, of course. And then I will just jump to the video that I recorded together with Sebastian on Schumann and Brahms. And then we can, well, couple of questions, but I think much shorter than this, because we wanted to get the opportunity to get all of this information, which is so interesting for us from you three. And then we open up the discussion. I'm already collecting the questions. So I proceed to share my screen. And please remember to mute yourself.
Schumann was regarded as the finest performer of her husband's music. She was not only one of the most relevant pianists of the 19th century, but also a very important piano pedagogue. Even if Clara Schumann lived long enough to have left recordings to posterity, she did not, but we can still rely on the recordings of her students as a source of inspiration. One of them, Fanny Davis, who was considered as the pianist who played most similar to Clara, recorded almost the entire set of the Davidsbündler Tänze in 1930. I studied her interpretation as an inspiration for recording the number 3 myself, which is among the ones she did not play. I tried to achieve a good accentuation using arpeggio and played basses earlier in order to create some of these accents, brought out some inner voices which were fundamental for Robert. And in the most lyrical passages, I incorporated what Kullak calls Auseinanderschlagen, so characteristic of Fanny's playing. This movement, signed by Florestan, had the indication of etwas Hanebüchen in its first version. Adelina de Lara, who recorded this piece in 1951, also with a Blüthner, remembers in her memoirs that Clara told her that she could go mad in the last movement of the carnival, the March of the Davidsbündler. And I tried to do so, imagining the sudden appearances of the witty Wuld from Jan Paul Richter's Flegeljahre, which is Florestan for Schumann.
Clara Schumann and Johannes Brahms shared many students. Nevertheless, they had also very strong musical personalities with their own particularities as pianists. Clara's daughter, Eugenie, wrote, "If I might venture upon comparison between my mother's teaching and his, I would say, my mother primarily stimulated imagination and feeling, Brahms, the intellect. To have been influenced by both was perhaps the most perfect teaching imaginable." In 1889, Brahms witnessed a technological revolution when he was given the chance to record for the newly invented Edison phonograph. In addition to the first of his Hungarian dances, he interestingly also recorded Josef Strauss' Polka Mazurka, The Dragonfly. Brahms professed great admiration for Johann Strauss, and they cultivated a solid friendship. Brahms even regretted about the Blue Danube Waltz, "Leider nicht von mir," unfortunately not by me. The waltzes, Opus 39, date from 1865, years before he met Strauss, but were composed in Vienna. Even if Brahms did unfortunately not leave us recordings of his waltzes, we still have important recordings of some of his friends and acquaintances, which inspired our performance. Alfred Grünfeld, who was called the waltz pianist par excellence by the Viennese, and highly praised by Brahms and Hanslick, embodies the Viennese tradition like no one else. He plays the waltzes with the most charming elegance.
The pleasure he seems to take in finding myriads of rhythmic and dynamic variations was an inspiration for us never to play anything the same twice, a rule strongly upheld in the Schumann-Brahms tradition. Ilona Eibenschütz, who was very close to Brahms and also a good friend of Strauss, had an almost impetuous personality which impressed Brahms very much. She also seems to have shared Brahms's disdain for dragged and exaggerated slow tempi, which inspired us to play some of the waltzes faster than most pianists usually do. Hungarian-born pianist József Weiss was maybe one of the most eccentric pianists at the turn of the century. An acclaimed student of Liszt, he still took great interest in the music of Brahms and recorded all his waltzes on a piano roll. We took his extremely free performance as an inspiration for the waltzes 9 and 10. In all of these recordings, we could find what Fanny Davis recalls of Brahms's style of interpretation. A way of playing which is very free, very elastic and expansive, but balanced with the feeling of the fundamental rhythms underlying the surface rhythms. Shaping phrases, but still connecting them through the accompaniment, and a careful treatment of the inner voices with a decidedly played left hand. These waltzes, like the Davidsbündler Tänze, can be considered as character pieces more than as mere salon dances. With this in mind, it is not surprising that all of these pianists of the Brahmsian tradition produced such different and individual interpretations of the same waltzes. Fanny Davis also tackled the possibility of very different renditions of a piece. One must not uphold one single and only way of arriving at a great goal, the aim being surely to arrive at conveying the highest message in any great work. I heard Brahms say once, "Machen Sie es, wie Sie wollen, machen Sie es nur schön." Do it how you like, but make it beautiful. After such words from the master himself, is there anything more for me to say?
Thank you so much, Laura. Beautiful playing, both of you. I would like to ask you maybe about the Auseinanderschlagen, if you could explain to us in what is means and how do you use it in your performance of Schumann?
Well, I think in general, I was also looking for other terms for arpeggiation, and to me is not 100% clear or whether this actually is for Kullak as a synonym of arpeggiation or not. But actually in German, well, we have 3 German speakers among us that can correct me, but I think auseinanderschlagen means to break into pieces or into two, or to knock into two, and auseinander means that one thing is apart from another, and it's of course a different word of arpeggiating, and I think for us arpeggiating has the connotation of necessarily arpeggiating from the bass to the melody. Actually, I found a critique of some critique of Clara's playing, where the journalist said the only mannerism which ever marks the playing of Madame Schumann is that of separating the notes of chords and octaves, and was noticeable to an unpleasant extent. Which of course I don't agree, but well, I don't know how she did it. And then I looked at Kullak. I think Sebastian has now the German original of it. Should I make a summary, Sebastian, or would you like to read something of it?
I don't think it's necessary to read the German original.
Yeah, so I think basically he recommends, Kullak recommends to use it for Doppelgriff, maybe meaning even chords, and for melodies to bring up the melody. And he complains about people who do it all the time between the bass and the melody. And then he says something that might sound a bit weird or bizarre to our perception of untogetherness or of arpeggiation, which is that he recommends to play the melody and the bass together and the accompaniment a bit before. I'm not sure if auseinanderschlagen could also be translated as dislocation or a synonym of dislocation, but in some moment he kind of speaks about arpeggiation just in a sentence just after, so he more or less implies that could be the same. And then he also says that especially if you have smaller hands, for special harmonies, that you can bring them out by arpeggiating. And what he says is that it's very important to do it ahead of the beat. So that the melody should be on the beat. So I don't know if this responds to your question. I mean, I was listening a lot to the recording of Fanny Davies and trying to incorporate it into my playing. Of course, the number 3 of the Davidsbündler, and that was also something that I wanted to experiment. And why I took this piece that she did not record was because it's also very energetic. So it's not the kind of arpeggiation that you would necessarily use for a slow piece. And I was also researching and talking with Sebastian about untogetherness and about how when looking at piano roll sometimes, and also even with electrical recording, sometimes you hear how when the hands are not together but not arpeggiated, there are sometimes the chords, each note of the chords comes in an apparently arbitrary order. So not necessarily first the bass, then alto, then tenor, alto, soprano, just to give an example for voices, but in other ways. And that's one of the things that I would like to research with with my PhD. Yeah.
Yes, Laura, I think Arten was asking if you found examples of this kind of arpeggiation in early recordings. Basically, I think you have said that.
He means of more. Maybe when we open up the discussion, he can or you can tell me yes now. What do you mean in particular? Because do you mean untogetherness or probably you mean the melody and the bass together and then the rest?
Yes, that's the one I meant. The one you were just reading a quote from.
Mm-hmm. Not that I can think of now, but I was looking at the role of Reinecke playing the Andante of the Pastoral Sonata, and there are some moments where he does, as I said, all kind of different order of the voicing. So it might be that I don't recall now that he does these bass and melody together and then the rest. He generally plays always the bass first and then then melody and then, for example, the rest. But but I'm sure there are cases. Yeah.
If I may add something, I think he is really referring to a very particular case, because he's saying explicitly Doppelgriffe, so a chord in the right hand that consists of only 2 notes, and that is something we find in a description of Ignaz Moscheles as well in one of his etudes, where he is telling to arpeggiate. I think there it's an etude in thirds or so, and so it might not be the same as just rolling chords where there are many notes in the middle voices, where it would really be a bit awkward. And I think in one of the Brahms, and in the second waltz of the Brahms set, and also in the number 9, we found examples in some of the recordings where we listened to, where there was a very obvious huge dislocation between those 2 notes, for especially something like a major sixth in the beginning of a piece, where it's played almost like a melodic upbeat between the inner voice and the upper one, and then the bass comes in. So I think that's what he refers to, and not just to, because then in the next sentence he says, yeah, well, you can also, of course, arpeggiate everything from the bass to the melody, and then the melody should be on the beat. But still, it's one of the very, very few quotes that refers explicitly to the timing of arpeggiation, which is always a big issue to discuss, because we are used so much, especially when we come from the harpsichord, to think of arpeggiation as something that has to be after the beat, because the bass always has to stick with the beat. So, yeah. Oh yes, thank you, Artem. I saw now it's sixths with in the Moscheles. Yeah, then it's basically the same thing.
Yes,
maybe they thought of the same.
I remember that example. Yes, I see what you mean. Yeah.
Cool. Well, changing a little the subject, maybe I could ask you, Laura, about what are your, because you use many different early recordings by different artists. And how did you mix all those recordings, or did you use one for a particular piece, or I mean, how do you manage to be influenced by so many different artists and make your own personal interpretation?
Well, I mean, in the case of the Davidsbündler, there is no recording of Fanny Davis, so I got inspired by other of the other movements. And about the case of the waltzes, we did not try to reenact, but we tried to get a general impression of different interpretations of different waltzes. So I think for the first one, we were inspired by Alfred Grünfeld. For the second one, by Ilona Eibenschütz. And for example, we tried to imitate her way of repeating the second part of the waltz much faster in the beginning. Then we took, as Sebastian says in the video, Joseph Weiss for the 9 and the 10. And then we took again Alfred Grünfeld for the 15. And well, actually there were other roles that we also listened to and that we had worked before with, and which are the which is James Quast with Frida Hoddap, and also the one of Gottfried Galston, who was a Viennese pianist, and who wrote actually Studienbuch, where he talks about these waltzes, and he for example, in his roles, he makes some interesting groupings of these waltzes. And another interesting thing that he does is that he takes the number 16 as the B part for the 15. So we played 15, 16, 15, as he does in his role. And at some moment, he even gives some kind of interlude between waltzes, some kind of written improvisation of how to connect these waltzes. This is something that we could have maybe, or we could do in another moment to try to do this. And maybe the other thing that we should say is that, of course, there are two versions of these waltzes. There's the, well, more than two, but there's the solo version and the four hands. And of course, in the case of Grünfeld or Ivanschütz, we were getting inspired by one pianist playing the piece. So we could not exactly do the same, because four hands works a bit differently in a way. So that was also a reason why not to imitate to the detail, but rather to get the general inspiration. I don't know if Sebastian, you would like to add something, or maybe even about Galston or Weiss, who are pianists who are not very well known nowadays.
Yeah, I don't think it's that important, except, of course, I don't know, is Camilla here? Is she with us? Because if she is, then she should say a few words about Weiss, because that's really what she was writing so wonderfully about in her PhD, which I think will also be published soon. Because, yeah, for Weiss as a Brahms player, we don't know that much about him yet, although I think, besides of Liszt, of course, whom he recorded a lot, Brahms was the other big one in his repertoire. And he recorded not only these waltzes, but also parts of the sonatas and the some variations. I forgot which one. I think probably the Handel variations. And I think so far no one has listened to these recordings. I myself was unable to find copies of them. Yeah, but he must have been a great Brahms player. But what makes him important is that he is one of the 3 Liszt students who recorded the Liszt B minor sonata, and that is why it's yeah, important to know him and to know his recordings and to read Camilla's dissertation about it.
Great.
Great, Laura. Maybe just the last question for you would be, since you're going to Vienna, Beethoven went to Vienna to get the spirit of Mozart from the hands of Haydn. Are you expecting to get the hidden spirit or the lost tradition of valses in that city? Or maybe Grünfeld will be more inspiring still?
Yeah, I know that the Viennese claim to have a tradition of playing waltzes, and well, of course, the Brahms waltzes are also, as we say in the video, a bit more of character pieces than just salon dances like Strauss. And I hope more to get this spirit from Grünfeld rather than rather than from the modern Viennese orchestras and the New Year's. I think there are evident also big differences in what we hear in the early recordings of waltzes, of Strauss waltzes, and what they do nowadays. And well, I'm not going to live in Vienna, but rather connect from here via Zoom. But
great. Good luck.
So we open up the discussion, and we we can read some of the questions that you have, and you can of course unmute yourself and yeah. So I think there was a remark from Miriam Gomez Moran. Hola, Miriam, who is the Liszt specialist.
Hola.
I don't know how you react to so many recordings of the more conservative.
Well, I think they are not so far from each other, in fact. And as I have said in a comment on the chat, I think there is a strong link between these two schools through Joachim, in fact, because he was working as a concertmaster at the Liszt's orchestra in Weimar. And well, he was used to work and to play under his baton. And therefore he must have acquired some habits from Liszt. And Liszt was
Oh, I think we lost you, Miriam.
The way of playing of these two schools, it was rather because they had the oh, I think my internet connection. Can you hear me well? Because I think my internet connection is not so good. Well, okay. I think the problem was much more a kind of aesthetic conception regarding composition. Wasn't I think they should have sounded quite similar. No, I mean, to our ears. Of course, for them there were some differences. I think perhaps the concept of tempo was a little bit different when we listened to Liszt students. It was perhaps more orchestral, more symphonic. And this can also be linked to some of Liszt's teaching. I don't know. I mean, as I have said, we have only the recordings of Liszt students to bear witness of what was being done in this school, and we don't know how Liszt sounded. In fact, we can know a lot of what Liszt wanted when he was asking his students to play his works. It's in fact quite easy to have a clear picture of this, but we don't have the same, I mean, we don't have a sound image, we don't have a recording by him. But I think, I mean, to discuss Liszt's playing or Liszt's school would take us hours or days or even weeks. So I don't think
you know, I would like to just quickly say a few words because I quite agree, actually. I think that there is not a big difference between a Joachim school and a Liszt school. In fact, they are both two instances of the same heritage, if you like. The only complaint or criticism that Joachim later had, apart from that he thought that Liszt was sometimes not taking music making seriously enough when he posed for whoever he was posing for, but the criticism from Joachim was mostly directed against not Wagner or Liszt themselves, but against the followers of especially Wagner and their overdoing things, which he actually said Wagner was not actually the one necessarily doing that, but in a way he was responsible because he never he never actually made sure to say that there is a limit to how much you can do in terms of tempo modification and things like that. So people coming after Wagner so much overdid it that it completely broke the concept that was behind it. And I think certainly Joachim had the greatest respect for Liszt and his playing, not the greatest respect for Liszt's compositions, but I think that's fair enough. And he had the greatest respect for Wagner's compositions, but not so much for his personality. But there is really, it's the same school that sort of divides at the end of the 19th century a little bit.
Yes, I mean, in fact, it's interesting also to know that, for example, another person who was between these two schools and perhaps belongs more to this school in terms of performance, who was Hans von Bülow, also used to do some things differently from what his master thought, from what Liszt thought. For example, Liszt in general praised Hans von Bülow's playing, but he was complaining about how big Bülow's Luftpausen, you know, this kind of breathing pauses, had gotten. So Liszt also did this kind of Luftpausen, but perhaps they were not so big as those made by Hans von Bülow. So it's always the same thing. I mean, for all of us who are teachers, we know that we can inspire our students, we can teach them a certain way of playing, but afterwards the students and the followers do whatever they want. So we cannot infer that what the students or the followers did is what the teacher did or the prominent figure did. No, of course it wasn't.
And of course, Joachim and Bülow had a lot of collaboration as well, very early on in Weimar, and then they sort of separated. But then Bülow, for instance, wrote about Joachim that's the ideal of performing Bach when he was writing about how to perform Bach on the piano.
Well, I would like to add something there because the question can be carried a little bit further, whether there is actually a difference in performance style between the Neue Deutsche Schule and the academic school. And I think, of course, when we listen to recordings by either of these schools, we tend to think they sound quite similar. And of course, they come from the exact same context in time. However, people would recognize a performance in the New German style from the performance style and not from the composition. So there must have been something that was recognizable to people who were living in this context, you know? So maybe we're just not ready to understand from their perspective what they would be able to know. And in this respect, it can be interesting to compare two recordings of Beethoven's Les Adieux Sonata. One is by a Liszt student, Otto Neitzel, and thank you, Sebastian, for providing this recording to me. And the other one, Carl Friedberg. They both play Les Adieux, and of course you know that this is a sonata where the Liszt circle claims it is highly programmatic. And this is something where obviously, as we know from musicological studies, where the academic school disagrees that there's not so much a program, a poetic program underlying in Beethoven's sonata. So you do hear a lot of similarities in Otto Neitzel's and Carl Friedberg's recording. However, Otto Neitzel is doing things that are a little bit more obvious or exaggerated, you might say. They are just a little bit more shaped than Carl Friedberg, although similar in motivation, you might say. And there might be the hypothesis that Otto Neitzel dares to do these things because he is playing a program of departure and friendship and these forces with Napoleon's army in front of the city and things like that, that did not so much affect Friedberg's choices. So the stylistic choices are still similar, but the choices in performance do differ considerably. And I would just invite you to go this one step further to look for what people were describing in their times, that there is indeed a difference, although they speak the same language that's a foreign language to us.
Yes, well, I completely agree, but also you would find such differences, for example, between Liszt students. For example, if you listen to the Feu Follet recordings by these students of him, they are very, very different from each other. So I'm not so sure. I mean, there was surely something which was very distinctive of Liszt and his school. And you have already mentioned something like that. Apparently, declamation was a very prominent feature in Liszt's playing. Declamation and also a love for strong accents. So this has to be probably a very important feature. I don't know, but well, in any case, I think most features like tempo freedom in certain styles, I'm speaking about interpretative styles, not about romanticism or Baroque or whatever. I'm speaking of, for example, cantabile style, military style, storm style. I mean, there are lots of them in Liszt, explained by Liszt in his teaching. So in certain styles like cantabile, like recitativo, like improvisatory style, tempo freedom was a constant thing. It was not when he was writing in another styles like funeral style, military style, liturgical style, and so on. So this can also be another difference. I don't know, but the problem is that the pieces in which we could probably find good examples of this have not been recorded by Liszt students normally. No, they tended to favor a certain kind of works, whereas I think that the most representative pieces for this have been neglected at that time, unfortunately. But in any case, I mean, I have written a huge dissertation on Liszt's playing, which is really a vast work, and which I hope it will be published in Spanish in a few months. And if you want, we could meet at another round table to discuss this topic in depth.
Yes, that would be fascinating to do a Lisztian round table. And actually, Miriam, you were mentioning the way of handling the tempo that can be more orchestral. And I think Aldo had a question that he did not have time to ask about the development of the Brahms sonata.
Oh, it's true. Well, maybe this question is especially for Johannes or Sebastian, that in the Opus 78 sonata, there is this phenomenon that the Brahms slows down the pace at the development. Most of the development is slower, and he has a little kind of accelerando towards the recapitulation. And Johannes, you were mentioning that there was some kind of misunderstanding in this situation. If you could explain us a little bit the misunderstanding.
You mean in Opus 78? But isn't that the same that Toby says? He says exactly the same. He says the development has got this sort of broadening of tempo, so that the tempo primo is not actually falling back and getting slower. That it's actually going into the tempo primo by accelerating into the first tempo again. Isn't that right, Sebastian?
Exactly, absolutely right. It's what Brahms writes. So I mean, so I don't know, the misunderstanding was mentioned by Toby, maybe, that some people thought that they had to slow down when they got to the recap.
But I'm not quite sure. Are you talking about the another piece about?
No, I think he's referring to what Toby says.
Yeah.
But what would the misunderstanding be that Toby is?
Oh, I see. Right. I think what Toby's referring to, that a lot of performers seem to think that tempo primo means getting slower again, because the development actually, from a modern perspective, quite easily gets you to speed up, which is not what Brahms intended, at least according to Tovey. And Tovey knew this from Joachim. So he didn't know it from Brahms, but I think Joachim probably was quite a good source for that. As far as in the text, it does say things like that, but it's not quite clear exactly where that applies to, and whether the end of the development should be faster or slower. I think Tovey is quite right to point that out as something that is not exactly clear from the music itself. But if you know what Joachim said about it, then that's what Brahms would have wanted.
And do you remember any other examples when a phenomenon like this happens, that we got into the recapitulation through even a slight accelerando?
Well, I think it is something that you hear a lot on early recordings, and it is something which we've sort of lost, because we don't in the modern world, the kind of accelerando into something is a very unusual thing, I find. You probably know more than I, being more involved in modern playing, but it's something that it's easier to do a ritardando from a modern perspective. We do what we call a rubato quite frequently, but we do it one way only, and we lose tempo all the time. But we find it very hard to accelerate. And if you listen to early recordings, and in fact, I think it's not something that is only happening in a German or in a Joachim school. It's something that we find quite often, even in French playing from the sort of very early 20th century, that there is a different way of modifying the tempo, which can move much more forward, where you taught, at least I was taught, if as soon as you start accelerating, that's a bad habit, don't do it. Put the metronome on so you're steady. And that's something they obviously hadn't the same kind of approach. Acceleration was a means of expression, and it could be used.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
We are getting some. Sorry that I interrupt. We are getting some examples from Nathan Pell. He's saying Beethoven fourth first movement, Leonore, Beethoven fifth first movement. These have accelerandos into the recap.
Yeah. Also, Brahms Opus 34, the piano quintet in the first movement, also has kind of accelerando into the recap. Certainly.
And because we were talking about Hans von Bülow, I'd just like to mention there's a recording of the 7th Beethoven Symphony with Richard Strauss, who was very close to Hans von Bülow and his assistant in Meiningen, and then took over. And if you listen to that recording, there's a lot of accelerating as an expressive means. And I think it's very beautifully done. And I think that really is in the kind of tradition of Wagner and Liszt.
Yeah, and Nathan also says, Johannes and Aldo, I think the misconception is this: most recapitulations slow down. This rule actually appears as early as Czerny, and it is evident in nearly all early recordings of sonata forms. Most musicians would have expected, therefore, to slow down here.
I would like to add something regarding Liszt's performance practice. There are many places in which Liszt really wanted tempo changes. So those changes were happening. That was not a problem, but he was strongly against going back and forth continuously. So he uses to mention that in the lessons. He calls that salon style, which was a kind of anti-style, in fact. So he didn't want that to happen. And also we know, because some students noted that in the writings, that he was using some kind of dislocation between hands, especially when playing in cantabile style. So that the melody was completely free from the accompaniment, and not only from the accompaniment, but he used to linger on certain notes, like notes with a strong emphasis, important notes. And apparently that made Liszt's rubato different from that of other pianists. For example, different from Chopin's rubato. That's what the students used to say. And well, I think the problem is that the students just left such witness in things that were strange for them, that were not the norm. For example, we don't find a single instruction by Liszt on hands dislocation, not a single one. So we must assume he was really arpeggiating and doing all kinds of things, because I mean, everybody was doing that at that time. But we don't know how he used to do that, because it's really not written anywhere. We only know that when he was arpeggiating, he was not only arpeggiating upwards, but also downwards. So you know, any kind of direction. But we don't know anything else, unfortunately. We know lots of things about sound color, about textures, about rhythmic elements, but we don't know really that much about voluntary arpeggiations.
Yes, I mean, I think we discussed this many times with Clive Brown, that there were many things that were not discussed, but then we hear in the recordings that that were done somehow, and that the lack of evidence doesn't mean that that maybe he did not dislocate. I think, and I think we still have other questions. From Christopher Woodard, I wonder if Kai and any other panelists who wishes to could share anything, any thoughts, I guess, he has on what early recordings might tell us about the ways in which our relationship to the written score has changed.
Yes, of course. Whenever you listen to early recordings, you will find that they don't care about the notation. And after initial irritation, you wonder why famous performers would not care about notation, and why this is such a widespread phenomenon. Of course, this is one of the most striking features of the historical recordings. And if you look into the recordings themselves, it's very difficult to determine why performers choose not to play the notation. So I think it's not possible to know about that by just listening to recordings, because they are just examples for the fact that they don't care about the text. So you need to go to the context, and this is what we've been doing systematically to try to get into the people's heads and their thinking and teaching. And it becomes very obvious very quickly that there is a two-step procedure for a performance to be developed. And the first step is, of course, to understand the notation and the text. And there's even a jargon, a professional jargon for professional musicians that has been used from the 18th century into the 19th century, that if you play the notation, that can be called a correct performance. But the correct performance, what we are trained to do in the 20th century tradition, this is not what they would consider an artistic performance. This was for amateurs or for beginners. But as soon as you reach a professional level of performance, the instructions tell you to depart from correct performance, to go deeper, to look behind notation. and to arrive at something that they would label as beautiful performance. So you really, we talked about that in 2 conferences in Sydney and Vienna, because this was the topic of a research grant that Neil Paris da Costa was awarded. The difference between what Spohr calls correct performance versus beautiful performance. And you find that, I did a study about that, you find that from the mid-18th century that people talk about exact or correct performance and beautiful performance decisions. It was never expected from a professional performer up until the 20th century to perform so that you can notate back the text. This is what we do today. We perform so you can notate the text. And this is completely turned around, or turning around what professional performance was expected to provide in earlier times, what you would call, well, maybe romantic performance practices, but it's actually much older. And this might bring us to a very interesting perspective of how much of the freedom that we can hear in these early recordings of late 19th century performers, how much this can be traced back into earlier times that are silent, where we don't have any recordings. Anyway, the teaching tells us that instructions have always differentiated between playing the notation and then taking the professional choices that go beyond. And in 19th century instructions, this means to bring to life the ideas of the composers and to understand the intentions, whatever the intentions are. And of course, we can discuss about this on this topic for hours and hours, but the intentions quite clearly mean to understand not the personal feelings, the hidden intentions of the composer's private ideas, but the intentions that the composer wanted to convey to the performers by notating on paper. So in a way, this can be translated, beautiful performance is understanding the motivation of the composer to create a musical emotion or a character or a situation. And this needs to be recreated rather than the notation itself. And this is why you will never find a performance that is just bringing the notation or just performing the notation in earlier recordings.
We were talking about the 2 Romanze recordings by Joachim and his grandniece, and I was just reminded of this because the differences there are, there's a passage which is in triplets, and there are dotted rhythms on top of the triplets. And there's obviously a lot of different ways of doing dotted rhythms on triplets. And the thing is that both of them do very different things, but what they don't do is any kind of pedantic rhythmic realization of the musical text. And I think that's what the modern recordings quite often do. They try to get everything accurately right. So you either have people being exactly on the triplet note, or you have performers who think, okay, it shouldn't be a triplet, it should be dotted, so it's coming after the triplet note and very particularly placed. But that's not what either Joachim or Jeli Darandi do in the Romanze. They actually are very, very flexible with the rhythm and don't stick to any kind of concept of having a rule of how dotted rhythm should be performed.
But I'm not even sure if this is already something that has something to do with recreating a particular intention of the composer, but that it was rather just a good taste not to do not to perform these rhythms literally and to shape them, and that there are probably some ways of shaping that would still be interesting to listen, but that could also go against the intention of the composers, but it was just the normal way of at least shaping something at all. And I would like to add one thing to what Kai was saying, and because maybe, I don't know, maybe he even disagrees, that I think when performers in the 19th century were aiming at discovering the composer's intention, they were mostly also still doing this from the perspective of being composers themselves. maybe not at a very high level, but at least most professional musicians had some experience in composing. And I think that changes considerably how you deal with notation.
Yes, it is quite interesting to see how Ferruccio Bosoni instructs the two-part inventions by Bach. He says, never go on stage before you would be able to compose your own Bach-style inventions. So this is really what's at the basis of this beautiful performance concept. You recreate the role of the composer when you're on stage, and this will, well, provide with all the freedom that you can take by recreating the moment of composition, the inspiration, and bringing the soul to the soul of the music to the listener. That's another very popular way of describing that. So in a way, it is easy to play a two-part invention or even a three-part invention, but it's very difficult to do that from this knowledgeable person of being a position of being able to compose your own inventions in Bach's style, which will probably also add some kind of a humbleness of the performer in the 19th century towards the object of performance, but still from a composer's perspective.
And I think a good example to see how this worked is to see that Reinecke writes in his instructions on Beethoven sonatas exactly something that at first glance might look at the opposite, and he says, well, so many people are overdoing it and they're putting themselves in front of the music as a performer, and no one, and then he says something like, no one who isn't a composer himself can really know what pain this gives to the composers if people treat the music like that. But then on the other hand, you see how Reinecke performs Mozart and Beethoven and Schumann, and how he deals with the score of those composers exactly from this very, very humble position. And Reinecke, I think, in comparison with all of us, he was a great composer. No one could write something like him, but in his opinion, and even in the opinion of some of his contemporaries, he was a rather modest composer in comparison with Beethoven and Mozart, and he was perfectly fine with admitting that. So he was a really humble guy.
So I think maybe with this beautiful moment, we should get to finish the session. I think there was just one question left that I just answered in the chat regarding the temperament of the fortepianos, of the piano and the Blüthner, and well, I want to thank you all. It was really an inspiring session. I know that it got very late. I'm sorry, Kai. I hope it's not a big problem for your family. There's just a last comment of Nathan. I would add to what Kai just said. Many music theorists from this period insist that an understanding of composition is totally necessary if one is to correctly perform a composer's harmony. For example, how does one know if a note is to be performed as an appoggiatura? One must know the governing harmony. Okay, so I think with this we close, and thank you very, very much. It was wonderful to meet you, and next week we are meeting again, I think in French this time, and it's going to be about the 2 CDs that La Nouvelle Athènes has published. Maybe Sylvie, you can say 2 words and also to say goodbye.
Hello, yes, thank you very much for this thrilling discussions, and I think it gives a lot of inspiration to everybody. We're very happy to have organized these roundtables during this lockdown time, and we found a lot of reaction and positive presence of the audience, we were almost every time 80 to 100. And I think it's a very nice way to share ideas. And I really thank the musicians to do so and to be so generous in the way they do it. And of course, I like so much their talent as well. And yes, indeed, before Christmas, we will do a last roundtable with Luca and Laura and the first musician of the La Nouvelle Athènes, the founders, which were recorded in 2019 in the Musée du Petit Palais for an exhibition on Paris romantique. And this is a beautiful record with Czerny, Weber, Adam, Liszt, Chopin, and there are very interesting performance position from the musicians. So you must come and listen to Laura, and there will be also Eduardo and Fernando Caida Greco, who recorded a Chopin Franco beautiful record, which is being released this month. So we hope to see you next week at 6 o'clock all together again, and we will speak French this time. So have a nice evening, and thank you, Laura, very much for all the work. And I
thank you, Aldo, also.
Yeah, I thank Aldo, I thank Johannes, I thank Kai and Sebastian, and also Sydney. She helped us a lot for
yes, thank you
for
so much,
promotion and so on. So we keep in touch, and thank you. Congratulations. Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.